Imagine this. You're Margot, a young bride of just 15 standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD. Your new husband, Henrik, is walking toward your marriage bed. The rushes beneath your bare feet crackle as you take nervous steps. The flickering candlelight casts shadows on his weathered face. He's nearly twice your age, chosen by your father for his 3 pigs and a half-acre of barley. Your hands shake as you clutch the rough woolen shift your mother made for this night, the same one she wore, and her mother before her. Through the thin walls you hear the sound of Henrik's friends outside, drunk on ale, shouting loud encouragements and banging pots with wooden spoons. They won't leave until they hear proof that the marriage was consummated. You breathe quickly as Henrik's calloused fingers reach for the leather cord at your throat. You wonder if your mother's whispered warnings about marital duties could have ever prepared you for this moment in this cramped, smoky room that smells of wet wool and unwashed bodies. This is not a love story. It's the reality of medieval intimacy, a world shaped by superstition, religious fear, and survival instincts. A time when sexual practices were not driven by love or desire, but by customs that would be completely foreign to how we understand romance today. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. And feel free to comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's amazing to explore these ancient stories together, connecting across time and space through our shared curiosity about the past. In the medieval bedroom, intimacy wasn't just a private matter, it was a political battlefield where the church's rules clashed with pagan traditions, and where the most personal moments of life were shaped by strange and often horrifying beliefs. These rules weren't just about personal choice, they were matters of eternal salvation, family honor, and life or death. Let's step back into Margot's world, where marital rape didn't exist because wives were considered property. In this world, menstrual blood was thought to be so dangerous it could kill crops. The wrong sexual position could even damn your soul to hell forever. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never private. The community, the church, and ancient superstitions all had a say in what happened between husband and wife. When Margot married Henrik in 1347, their union wasn't celebrated with champagne and dancing. It was a business deal, sealed with bodily fluids, and witnessed by neighbors who had every right to demand proof of consummation. The wedding night ritual started long before the couple even touched. First came the bedding ceremony, where guests dragged the bride and groom to their chamber, undressed them while singing crude songs, and then stood outside, listening for sounds that would prove the marriage was valid. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot's cries of pain, proof that her hymen had been broken and the marriage was consummated. But here's where medieval intimacy gets really strange. The church taught that even married couples could sin in their own beds. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century AD, said a man who loves his wife too much is an adulterer. The church believed that too much pleasure, even within marriage, corrupted the soul. This wasn't just a theory, it affected every part of medieval sexual life. Thomas Aquinas, a key medieval theologian, laid out rules for married couples in his Summa Theologica around 1265 AD. Sexual intercourse was only allowed on certain days of the week, during specific seasons, and in one position, man on top, woman beneath, face to face. Any variation was considered unnatural and sinful. Oral sex was completely forbidden, as was sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. The church believed that if all these rules were followed, married couples would only be able to have sex about 50 days a year. Margot would have learned these rules from her mother, who was taught them by the village priest during confession. The fear of eternal damnation hung over every intimate moment. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she faced a terrible choice: submit to her husband's desires and risk her soul, or refuse and face his anger in a world where domestic violence was not only legal but expected. The medieval view of female sexuality was based on a fundamental misunderstanding that lasted for centuries. Medical texts from the time, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman beliefs, taught that women were simply defective men. Their sexual organs were seen as inverted versions of male genitalia. The vagina was viewed as an inside-out penis, and the ovaries were considered internal testicles. This wasn't just ignorance, it was the accepted medical knowledge taught in universities across Europe. These beliefs had serious consequences for how medieval people viewed female desire and pleasure. The 11th century physician Constantine the African claimed that women experienced sexual pleasure differently from men. In the medieval period, it was believed that conception required prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes. This led to the odd idea that rape could not result in pregnancy because a woman couldn't achieve the necessary pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after an assault, medieval courts often saw it as evidence that she had enjoyed the experience and was therefore partially responsible. Margot's mother might have warned her about the wandering womb, a condition medieval doctors believed could cause hysteria, madness, and even death. They thought the womb could move inside a woman's body, either traveling upwards to strangle her heart or downwards to escape through the vagina. To treat this, they would fumigate the vagina with pleasant scents to coax the womb back into place, or use foul-smelling substances to draw it downward. Medieval Europe inherited a mix of fertility beliefs from earlier pagan traditions which the Church never fully erased. Wise women in the village, often later accused of witchcraft, had secret knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices designed to either promote conception, prevent pregnancy, or ensure the birth of male children. In the forests around Margot's village, women would gather specific plants during the full moon. Pennyroyal and tansy were brewed into teas believed to prevent pregnancy. Although the dosage between contraception and death was dangerously narrow, the mandrake root, shaped like a human, was thought to increase fertility when worn as an amulet against the skin. The root was so valuable that counterfeit versions made from carved briar were common in medieval markets. The Church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, but even the most devout Christians couldn't entirely abandon them. The boundary between folk medicine and magic was difficult to define. A woman might pray to Saint Margaret for a safe childbirth while burying a piece of afterbirth under her threshold to ensure future fertility. She might wear a crucifix to church while secretly carrying a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. Medieval contraception was a dangerous mix of superstition, poison, and desperation. Women were taught to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse to avoid conception or drink wine mixed with ground-up bees. Even more dangerous were potions made with mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that often killed the woman along with any potential pregnancy. The consequences of unwanted pregnancy were severe. Without reliable contraception, women faced the constant threat of death during childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after giving birth. For unmarried women, pregnancy often meant social ruin, exile, or even death. Infanticide, though officially condemned, was widely seen as a desperate last resort. Marriage negotiations in the medieval period were conducted like military campaigns, with women's bodies as the battlefield. When Margot's father arranged her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was literally her dowry, more valuable than any gold or livestock he could offer. The hymen became a symbol of honor, exchanged between families as proof of the bride's purity and their own reputation. The wedding night wasn't just about consummating the marriage, it was about publicly proving the bride's virginity. The blood-stained sheets were displayed for the gathered guests as proof that the marriage was legitimate. If no blood appeared, the bride could be returned to her family in disgrace, branded as impure, or even killed for fraud. The pressure on young brides was enormous. Some would secretly prick their fingers or hide chicken blood to fake the evidence that their new families demanded. However, medieval medicine's understanding of virginity was deeply flawed. It was believed that the hymen was a solid membrane completely blocking the vaginal opening, rather than the flexible tissue it actually is. The absence of a hymen was taken as absolute proof of sexual activity, when in fact it could be torn through activities like horseback riding, heavy lifting, or simply due to natural variations in anatomy. The Church's doctrine of consummation led to even stranger practices. A marriage wasn't legally binding until sexual intercourse had occurred. which meant proving or disproving consummation became a legal matter. Church courts would examine both the husband and wife, questioning them separately about their wedding night and inspecting the woman's body for signs of penetration. They would even question neighbors about what they had heard through the walls. Medieval sexual positions were strictly regulated by church teachings, but the reality was more complicated. The missionary position wasn't just preferred, it was the only position that wouldn't condemn your soul to hell. The church taught that any position with the woman on top was unnatural because it went against the natural order of male dominance. Rear entry was considered bestial, as it was thought to link human sexuality to animal mating practices. Yet, medieval literature hints at a more complex reality. The fabliaux, bawdy comic tales popular in medieval France describe sexual encounters that would have scandalized church authorities. These stories, often told by traveling minstrels in taverns and market squares, reveal a hidden world where couples experimented with forbidden practices, despite the threat of eternal damnation. The French poet Andreas Capelanis, writing around 1184 AD, even provided detailed instructions for sexual positions and techniques as part of elaborate courtship rituals. His work suggests that, at least among the nobility, there was a deeper understanding of sexual pleasure that went beyond the strict teachings of the church. However, these practices were dangerous secrets. If discovered, they could lead to excommunication, exile, or even death. Medieval people lived in constant fear of sexual demons, believed to prey on humans during their most vulnerable moments. The succubus and incubus were more than just folklore, they were considered real by medical and theological authorities. The church taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual intercourse. The succubus, a female demon, was blamed for nocturnal emissions, sexual dreams, and any sexual thoughts outside of marriage. Medieval theologians had elaborate theories about how these demons worked. They believed a demon could first take female form to collect semen from a man, then transform into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. Any child born from such a union was considered cursed or demonic. The incubus posed an even greater threat to women. These male demons were believed to be stronger than men and could overpower their victims. Women who reported sexual dreams or unexplained experiences were often accused of consorting with demons. The line between being a victim and a witch was terrifyingly thin. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was seen as a demonic assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often feeling pressure on their chest, were believed to be under attack by demons. The church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were burned as witches instead. Medieval beliefs about menstruation were rooted in terror and superstition. Menstrual blood was thought to be so toxic that it could kill crops, spoil wine, and even cause men to lose their vitality. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose writings were still taught in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could drive dogs mad and cause knives to lose their sharpness. Women during their periods were seen as dangerous pollutants who had to be isolated from society. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, women on their periods were required to live in separate huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making every monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame. The lack of understanding about menstruation led to bizarre medical practices. Physicians believed that if menstrual blood wasn't properly expelled, it would accumulate and poison the woman from within. They often prescribed bloodletting, purging, and other dangerous treatments to balance the female humors. Some doctors even recommended sexual intercourse as a cure for menstrual disorders, believing that male semen could neutralize the toxic effects of menstrual blood. Medieval women developed their own knowledge to manage their cycles. They used moss, cloth rags, and sheepskin as primitive forms of menstrual protection. They tracked their cycles by the lunar phases and created herbal remedies to ease cramps and regulate their flow. This knowledge was passed down secretly through generations of women, hidden from male physicians and church authorities who would have condemned it as witchcraft. The medieval period also saw the rise of complex theories about sexual compatibility based on astrology, bodily humors, and physical traits. Medieval doctors believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the right balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband might be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to sexual problems and infertility. Physical examinations of potential spouses were common among wealthy families. Physicians would inspect the bride's body to look for signs of fertility, such as wide hips, while narrow hips were seen as a sign of infertility. The groom's penis size and shape were also analyzed for compatibility. These examinations were done with the same clinical detachment as inspecting livestock. The church had its own theories about sexual compatibility, based on spiritual rather than physical traits. They taught that couples who were too closely related by blood or spiritual kinship would be cursed with sexual problems and monstrous children. The complex rules of consanguinity meant many medieval marriages were annulled when hidden family connections were discovered. Medieval sexuality was deeply connected to ideas of honor, shame, and social status. A man's sexual ability was closely tied to his reputation as a warrior and leader. Impotence wasn't just a personal failing, it was a public disgrace that could ruin a man's standing in the community. The medieval French created elaborate euphemisms for sexual dysfunction, developing a vocabulary of shame that affected all social interactions. For women, sexual reputation was even more fragile. The slightest hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's marriage prospects and her family's honor. Medieval towns were small, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. A woman seen talking to a man who wasn't her husband or relative could be labeled a prostitute. The standards for women's behavior were so strict that even married women lived in constant fear of gossip and accusations. The medieval legal system reflected these sexual anxieties in its treatment of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape was not seen as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against the man who owned her, her father, husband, or lord. The punishment for rape in medieval times varied greatly depending on the social status of the victim and the perpetrator. If a nobleman raped a peasant woman, he might only have to pay a small fine. However, if a peasant raped a noblewoman, the punishment could be torture or even death. Adultery was punished even more severely, but only if the woman was involved. A married woman who slept with any man other than her husband could be killed by him without facing any legal consequences. Medieval law specifically gave husbands the right to murder adulterous wives and their lovers if they were caught in the act. On the other hand, men were generally free to have sex with unmarried women, prostitutes, or even their own servants without facing any legal penalties. The medieval period also saw the development of courtship rituals that would influence European culture for many centuries. The idea of courtly love, made popular by the troubadour poets, created a parallel world where sexual desire was seen as a spiritual journey. These romantic ideals were mainly a literary fantasy enjoyed by the nobility, but they had a deep impact on how people in medieval times understood love and sex. Courtly love taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage. A knight's devotion to his lady was supposed to remain unfulfilled, existing in a constant state of yearning that would purify the soul through suffering. This idea created a strange divide between marital sex, which was seen as purely functional, and romantic love, which was viewed as purely spiritual. In reality, courtship in medieval times was much more practical. Among the peasantry, people often had some say in who they married, but financial and social considerations always took priority over personal choice. A village girl might prefer the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, she would end up marrying a man she barely knew. Engagement practices in medieval times included rituals to test whether potential spouses were physically compatible. In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together while fully clothed, separated by a wooden board known as a bundling board. This practice allowed families to assess whether the couple was physically suited to each other without risking pregnancy or violating church rules about premarital sex. Medieval Europe inherited a complicated tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals from ancient pagan cultures. Although these practices were suppressed by Christian authorities, they didn't disappear completely. Peasants continued to practice ancient fertility rituals, often disguising them as Christian celebrations or incorporating them into folk medicine. The celebration of May Day, for example, kept strong sexual overtones, even though the church tried to suppress them. Young people would spend the night in the forest, supposedly gathering flowers and branches for village decorations. In reality, May Day was a chance for sexual experimentation and courtship outside the usual village restrictions. Many pregnancies were likely the result of May Day encounters, leading to a rise in February births. Wedding celebrations often included fertility rituals meant to ensure the couple could have children. The bride might be showered with grain or nuts to encourage pregnancy. The marriage bed would be blessed with holy water, but it would also be secretly prepared with herbs and charms believed to increase fertility. These practices were an attempt to control reproduction in a time when infant mortality rates were high and family survival depended on having healthy children. Medieval ideas about conception were a strange mix of Aristotle's philosophy, Christian teachings, and folk beliefs. Physicians believed that both men and women produced seed, which would combine during intercourse to create new life. They also thought that female orgasm was necessary for conception, which led to the tragic belief that women who became pregnant after rape must have enjoyed the experience. Medieval people also developed theories on how to influence the sex of unborn children. They believed that conception during certain phases of the moon would result in male children, while other phases would produce females. The positions of the stars at the moment of conception were also thought to influence not only the child's sex, but also its future personality and prospects. As time went on, medieval society developed increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual control and surveillance. The church set up networks of informants who would report on their neighbors' private lives. Confession became a way for priests to gather intimate details about people's sexual practices, with penitents being questioned about their most private moments. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century brought even more extreme levels of sexual persecution. Suspected heretics were tortured until they confessed not only their religious beliefs, but also their sexual practices. Inquisitors' manuals included detailed questions about sexual positions, the frequency of intercourse, and even the physical sensations people experienced during sex. Medieval prisons included special punishments for sexual crimes. Women convicted of adultery might be locked in cages so small they couldn't stand up, fed only bread and water until they died of starvation. Men convicted of rape might be publicly castrated before being hanged. These extreme punishments weren't just meant to punish the guilty, they were designed to terrorize the entire community into sexual submission. The medieval period produced a large body of sexual advice and instruction, although most of it was hidden from the general public. Medical texts included detailed descriptions of sexual positions and techniques, but these were only available to educated physicians and wealthy patrons. Most ordinary medieval people learned about sex through whispered conversations, folk songs, and the painful lessons of trial and error. The church also created its own sexual literature, but it was mostly focused on cataloguing sins rather than offering guidance on healthy sexual practices. Penitential manuals listed many sexual practices, along with their corresponding punishments. These texts show an intense focus on sexual details that go against the church's official stance on celibacy and purity. Medieval marriage guides written for wealthy patrons provide insight into the sexual lives of the nobility. These books gave advice on everything from wedding night tips to managing sexual relationships during pregnancy. They reveal that the nobility had a much more complex understanding of sexual pleasure, which was kept hidden from the general public, but clearly practiced by those who could afford privacy. The medieval period also developed increasingly complex methods for punishing and controlling sexuality. The chastity belt, though probably rarer than modern depictions suggest, was an extreme measure used to control female sexuality. These devices were not just physical restraints, but symbols of the fear surrounding female sexual autonomy. Brothels in medieval times were both legal and illegal at the same time. The church officially condemned prostitution, but secular authorities often regulated and licensed it. Medieval cities even had official red light districts where prostitutes worked under government supervision. These women were required to wear specific clothing, live in designated areas, and undergo regular medical checks. Medieval Europe also had some of the strangest sexual customs in history. One such custom, the rite of the first night, allegedly gave feudal lords the right to sleep with a peasant's bride on her wedding night. While historians debate if this actually happened, just the possibility reveals how vulnerable medieval peasant women were. Medieval people believed that sexual acts could influence everything from the weather to the success of military campaigns. Kings and nobles consulted astrologers to determine the best time for sexual intercourse, thinking that the cosmic forces during conception could shape their children's future. Military commanders even ordered their soldiers to abstain from sex before battle, believing it would drain their strength. Medieval village communities created complex systems of social pressure to regulate sexual behavior. Young people were rarely allowed to be alone together, and married couples were expected to follow the community's standards regarding intimacy. The Church's teachings greatly influenced the medieval understanding of sexual pleasure. The Church taught that sexual pleasure was a trap set by the devil to distract people from spiritual reflection. Even within marriage, excessive enjoyment of sex was seen as a sin that could lead to eternal damnation. Medieval people developed various ways to suppress sexual desire and control their bodies. Fasting, cold baths, and physical punishment were commonly used to reduce sexual urges. Young people were advised to avoid anything that might lead to sexual arousal, including certain foods, music, or forms of entertainment. Despite the Church's attempts to control sexuality, there was a hidden culture of sexual rebellion in the medieval period. People found ways to express their desires and pursue pleasure, even within the repressive system. This underground world of sexual freedom existed alongside the dominant culture of control. Sexuality in medieval times was shaped by practical issues that modern people often overlook. The lack of privacy in medieval homes meant that sex often happened in shared spaces, with children, servants, and extended family members nearby. The sounds and smells of sexual activity were part of daily life in ways that would shock people today. Medieval sexuality was also deeply tied to social class. The nobility had access to private chambers, exotic foods, and leisure time, allowing them to explore sexual pleasure in ways that peasants couldn't. For peasants, marriage was about survival, not love or sexual satisfaction. In a time when life expectancy was short and infant mortality was high, marriage's primary purpose was to produce children who could inherit the family name and work the land. Though the medieval period produced some of the strictest sexual customs in European history, it also saw the rise of resistance and rebellion. People found ways to pursue pleasure, despite immense social and religious pressure to conform. As we return to Margot in her stone cottage, Henrik's hands reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we can understand her fear. It's not just personal fear, but the weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties pressing down on her. She carries the burden of religious beliefs, family honor, community surveillance, and her own desperate need for survival in a world that offers no protection. The medieval period reminds us that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, fear, and social control. The strange and often unsettling practices and beliefs of medieval people may seem foreign to us today, but they were born from the same basic human needs and desires that shape sexual behavior in every era. Understanding medieval sexuality helps us see how our own sexual culture is influenced by the power structures and social anxieties of our time. Medieval intimacy was never private. It was always public, always political, and always dangerous. The bedroom became a battleground where souls were won and lost, where family honor was defended or destroyed, and where the most private moments of life were dictated by rules that seemed designed to remove pleasure and increase suffering. The medieval period produced some of the most restrictive sexual customs in European history, but it also reveals the incredible resilience of human sexual desire. Despite centuries of religious persecution, social control, and legal punishment, medieval people found ways to experience love, pleasure, and connection. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human life, too powerful to be fully controlled by any system of authority. The bizarre sexual practices of medieval Europe were not simply the result of ignorance or superstition, they were shaped by a complex mix of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, economic necessity, and genuine human need. Understanding these practices helps us see how far we've come and how many of the same tensions continue to affect human sexuality today. In the end, the medieval period teaches us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, and always an essential part of human life. The strange and often disturbing intimate practices of medieval people were their way of navigating the age-old conflict between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the pursuit of sexual freedom and true intimacy is not a modern idea, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends time. As we return to Margot in her stone cottage, Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we now understand that this moment carries the weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties. It's filled with fear, superstition, desperate hopes for survival, and the eternal human longing for connection, despite overwhelming odds. In Margot's trembling hands and Henrik's rough fingers, we see not just two individuals, but the clash of an entire civilization's sexual tensions and desires unfolding in the most private space imaginable. Yet it was never truly private, never truly safe, and never truly free.